Morning, folks. Hi, this is Congressman Johnson. I'm listening to Representative Davis's comments on John Lewis, and boy, I tell you, I graduated from Troy University, where John was born in Alabama, and so honored to have served with him. Before I give my opening remarks and then turn it over to my colleague Danny Davis. Danny, why don't you say a few words about John Lewis, and then I'd ask you to lead us in a moment of silence in honor of him.
Well, thank you very much. You know, we've learned so many things as a result of John. I never knew that you attended the university at Troy, Alabama.
Yeah, John was one of the first people that I sought out when I was first elected to Congress in 2010. When I showed up here in January of 2011, John was one of the first people I sought out because I heard that there was a guy from Troy, and I did a little bit of research on him, and of course found out all that he had been involved in his work with Dr. King, and it was I did not realize that he was from Troy, but such a great guy.
Well, I think John was the epitome of suggesting and recommending to people that it's not so important where you come from. We often tell young people who grow up in poverty, who live in inner city communities, who live in disadvantaged areas, who live in rural America, whose heritages may not have been what they thought they wanted them to be. I too come from rural America. My parents were sharecroppers. I did all of the things that John did. I picked cotton, chopped cotton. As a matter of fact, the last job that I had before I came to Chicago, I was earning $3 a day, working in the cotton field, and worked with migrant farm workers. And so that's why we say that America is the America that it is. It's not always a matter of what your heritage may have been, but it's always what you combined with all of what this country has become strives to make it. And that was the life of our colleague, John Lewis, and he did it extremely well. Man who had a tremendous sense of humor. He was a great spiritual guy. He always was willing to help, but he never lost confidence in America. He always figured that if we continued towards making this a more perfect union, that there is fulfillment in the thoughts and ideas of our foreparents and forefathers and foremothers who put together the Constitution. So if we could, before we start our hearing, why don't we just pause for a moment of silence in memory and in honor of our colleague, John Robert Lewis. If I had a gavel, I would say done. And thank you very much. And Bill, we're back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Danny. Well, before I get started with my comments, let me say, you and I need to have a cup of coffee, because you and I have a lot more in common, my friend, than I realized we did, because I too have picked both cotton and tobacco by hand and walked behind a mule in the farm fields and cooked and heated on big old black pot-bellied stoves because we didn't have indoor heat and air and plumbing. So we got a lot to talk about. So God bless you, my friend. Well, good morning, everybody. I am Congressman Bill Johnson. For those of you that I've never met, I think I've met most of you. Thanks for attending today's very important briefing on the upcoming parliamentary elections, the current political climate, and also the impacts of coronavirus in Sri Lanka. You know, while we attempt to mitigate the impacts of COVID here in the U.S., this briefing is very, very timely, and I appreciate all of you joining with us. As you just heard from my friend and colleague, Danny Davis, he and I have been co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on Ethnic and Religious Freedom in Sri Lanka since its founding in 2013. The focus of this caucus is to increase awareness and educate other members of Congress on the protection of rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Shortly after we started this caucus back in 2013, we saw some progress, albeit slow, had been made to increase democratic principles and to restore human rights for all Sri Lankans, notably due to the election of the Sirisena government in 2015. However, Sri Lanka's newly elected president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as well as his brother and former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, have been implicated in numerous human rights violations, including war crimes from Sri Lanka's decades-long civil war. Their election raises serious concern that progress in transitional justice reform is now in jeopardy. What's more, the ability of the Rajapaksa government to hinder transparency and provide protections of human and civil rights for Sri Lanka's ethnic and religious minorities is extremely alarming. And it's an issue that the international community must continue to pay close attention to. And it's also why the upcoming parliamentary elections are so important. After dissolving the parliament in early March, this election could really potentially bolster the Rajapaksa's power should their political party win a supermajority in the parliament. So I look forward to hearing the perspectives of our esteemed panel on these issues and also getting an update on the political climate in Sri Lanka leading up to these critical elections. You know, regardless of the election outcome, it's vitally important that the United States and the international community at large continue paying close attention to the actions of the Rajapaksa government. Human rights abuses cannot be tolerated, and those who commit such atrocities must be held accountable. So, Danny, let me turn it back over to you. My colleague, Representative Danny Davis, good to talk with you this morning. Danny will introduce our panelists in addition to his opening comments.
Thank you very much. You know, it has been my pleasure to work with Representative Johnson now for this number of years that we have co-chaired the caucus. And as my daddy often would say, you learn something new all the time. And one of the things about interacting is you get additional information. And I think there has been progress. As a matter of fact, two of the friends that I made dealing with Sri Lanka, both were assassinated. The gentleman who hosted my trip when I came and we spent the week together, he and his wife, he was a member of parliament, and both he and his wife were assassinated coming out of their church on a holiday. And then the person who followed him and was elected to replace him was also assassinated. So we got involved as the war was ending, but hostilities still existed. Well, the civil war in Sri Lanka ended May 18th, 2009. It has been 11 years now, and the transition of 3 presidents has done very little to move toward a democracy that would protect the rights and identity of ethnicities and pluralism in Sri Lanka. The issue of human rights abuses is still before the UN Commission for Human Rights. There is a need for Sri Lanka to follow through on the promises it made to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It appears that the return of the Raspakas family influence poses serious threats to Sri Lankan religious and ethnic minorities and the continuation of democracy. Regardless of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and religion, no one should be excluded from society, the economy, and the political life through discrimination, harassment, persecution, and all manner of injustices, not only in Sri Lanka, but anywhere in the world. I am reminded of the words in a letter Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from his Birmingham jail cell. And he said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. There has been progress, there has been movement, and I think we've been successful in helping other members of the U.S. House of Representatives understand the situation. I noted in the appropriations report a mention of Sri Lanka and what is expected if resources are to be coming continuously to the government of that country. So today we will hear from our distinguished panel to share more information and knowledge on the current status of human rights and the implementation of transitional justice in Sri Lanka. Our panelists will come in the manner in which I introduced them. Ms. Yasmin Suka, South Africa, is a leading human rights lawyer. She is currently the executive director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South, the founder of the International Truth and Justice Project, Sri Lanka, and a member of UNHRC appointed Commission on Human Rights in South Africa. In South Sudan, Ms. Suka served on the South African Truth Commission on Human Rights. She was appointed by the United Nations to serve on the Truth Reconciliation Commission of Sierra Leone, 2002 to 2004, and in 2010, she was appointed to the three-member panel of experts advising the Secretary General on accountability for war crimes committed during the final stages of the war in Sri Lanka. Neil Devada is a professor of politics and international affairs. His research interests include South Asian security and politics, ethnicity and nationalism, ethnic conflict resolution, and democratic transition and consolidation. He is the author of Blowback, Linguistic Nationalism, Institutional Decay and Ethnic Conflict in Sri Lanka. His current research examines the links between nationalist ideologies and commuted violence in South Asia. Manisha Ganguly is South Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, and before that, a researcher for HRW since 2004. She has worked on a broad range of issues, including police reform, sexual violence, discrimination based on religion or caste, freedom of expression, and armed conflict. In Nepal, Ganguly continues to press for accountability rights, violations during an armed conflict, and for reform to bring abusive members of the government forces and the Mayos combatants to justice. With the end of Sri Lanka's conflict, she advocated for human rights abuses in the Sri Lankan military, as well as in the Tamil Tigris forces, to be held accountable. Reverend Dr. Japan Cruz serves the Manor Catholic Diocese in northwestern Sri Lanka. He has taught at the seminary for 20 years and dedicated himself to his community during both peace and war. We thank our panelists and ask Ms. Yasmin Sukha to begin.
Good afternoon, good morning, chairpersons, and thank you very much to the Congressional Caucus for inviting me to brief you on the current situation in Sri Lanka. As you rightly pointed out, next week as Sri Lankans go to the polls to elect a new parliament, there is some concern that this election will give President Rajapaksa either an outright 2/3 majority that he needs to amend the constitution, or that he will cobble together a coalition through horse trading after the polls, enabling him to do the same. Either way, he looks set to gain almost total control. Sri Lanka, of course, clearly illustrates the limits of majoritarian democracy, that the mere holding of elections does not guarantee either the rule of law or the usual checks and balances. We know that regular elections have not prevented 3 periods of mass atrocities in Sri Lanka, in which tens of thousands of citizens, ethnically Sinhala and Tamil, were killed, tortured, and disappeared. Both the current president and the current army commander were actively involved in the brutal crushing of 2 of these insurrections, the JVP in 1989 and the LTTE in 2009. And so elections in Sri Lanka have become really fertile ground for the exploitation of ethnic and religious divisions for political gain, as well as to provide protection against prosecution. As you rightly pointed out, there were enormous gains when the Sirisena government in 2015 committed to implementing a comprehensive transitional justice program designed to promote accountability and to build sustainable peace in the aftermath of the bitter conflict. This was really in recognition that without this, Sri Lanka would not be able to deal with a legacy of decades of mass atrocity crimes, and transitional justice, which traces its genealogy to the Nuremberg trials and to the Latin American experiences, and also influenced the trajectory of justice and accountability in my own country, South Africa, where I was appointed by the late President Mandela to serve on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. President Mandela believed that without justice and accountability, there could be no nation building or reconciliation. The Sirisena government committed to establishing a hybrid court, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an Office of Missing Persons to deal with the tens of thousands who disappeared during the final phase of the war. And this represented the last hope for the desperate Tamil population that there would be justice. Unfortunately, these aspirations have not been met, and even the Office of Missing Persons has not been able to call to account the powerful security force officials responsible for summary executions and enforced disappearances of the surrenderies in May 2009. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been unequivocal in his intention to withdraw from any commitment made to the international community in respect of accountability for past crimes. Instead, he has appointed his cronies, military officials implicated in serious international crimes, to senior posts in government, and at least 13 serving or retired military officials have already been placed in key civilian jobs, with police and law and order functions being placed under them. All of them served with them during the final phase of the war. COVID-19 too has become a convenient cover for militarization and securitization, the president established a series of presidential task forces, which in fact establish almost a parallel state in which parliament has been bypassed. These task forces are replete with military officials and many individuals who faced corruption charges under the previous regime. He also established a presidential commission of inquiry to look into the alleged victimization under the previous government, which is clearly designed to shield those alleged perpetrators from prosecution. This is an achievement in itself to try and convert perpetrators into new victims. The establishment of this commission, however, has provoked intense fear in the civil service, as it has signaled to those independent policemen and prosecutors who sought to do their jobs without fear or favor under the last government that they will be hunted down, and this has significantly undermined the criminal justice system. Brazenly, Sri Lanka's quarantine process is managed by Shivendra Silva, the army commander who has been designated under the United States appropriations law for alleged gross violations of human rights. The COVID-19 track and tracing program is under the helm of the country's state intelligence chief, Major General Suresh Sali, who recently threatened litigation, not just against me, but my organization, for conspiracy against the state, because we named him as the official allegedly responsible for compelling a doctor in detention to provide false testimony about the numbers of civilians present in the war zone. The doctor in question risked his life to save thousands of civilians and is now a US citizen currently treating COVID patients in a United States hospital. The tragic Easter bombings in Sri Lanka last year revealed staggering intelligence failures, which should have prompted the international community to question the lack of security sector reform, given their 4 years of investment in this program. COVID-19, of course, has led many countries, including the United States, to search the way for ways in which assistance can be provided, but in a way which would not taint or violate the Leahy law. This caucus, of course, probably needs no reminder that one of the exemptions for Leahy law is humanitarian relief, and COVID-19 provides an opportunity for this exemption. And this is, of course, one of the areas we should be looking forward to in the future. Human rights defenders who work in Sri Lanka, including my own organization, are facing significant threats which have been extensively documented. Muslim and Tamil lawyers and journalists have increasingly been targeted. Minorities, particularly Tamils and more recently Muslims, continue to be demonized, either as terrorists, LTTE tigers, and Muslim fundamentalists. The recent roundup of many young Tamils in the north and east of the country and who have been accused of wanting to restart the LTTE and the targeted attacks on Muslim and Tamil lawyers serve as a warning not to challenge the all-powerful state. Furthermore, the UN Human Rights Committee has itself questioned the selective application of Section 3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act of 2007, which has been used extensively by the Sri Lankan government to target minorities while rarely being invoked in respect of incitement and hate crimes perpetrated by the majority community. The construction, of course, of Sri Lanka as a nationalist, secular, and Buddhist country represents really a denial of the plurality and diversity that exists in Sri Lanka. The United Nations has also commented on the intolerance by the current regime, the tolerance rather by the current regime of hate speech against minority communities, particularly by many Buddhist monks, which represents a threat to building national unity and, quite frankly, is downright dangerous. You've spoken eloquently about the pursuit of accountability. And of course, in present-day Sri Lanka, this is almost impossible. And as one of the organizations pursuing criminal and civil cases for serious international crimes. We've worked extensively with many organizations to collect and preserve evidence of war crimes, building an extensive database of evidence. But given the complete lack of accountability, we've had to pursue criminal and civil cases against war criminals abroad. And this has resulted in the compilation of perpetrator dossiers on those implicated in serious international crimes. These dossiers seek to name them and are used for a range of innovative accountability processes, including vetting for peacekeeping, visa vetting, and vetting for diplomatic appointments. The dossiers have come to symbolize new innovative forms of combating impunity. However, as human rights defenders all over the world will attest to, there's a price to pay for doing this kind of work. Increased surveillance, harassment, the intimidation of witnesses, targeted fake news, and more recently, defamation litigation. And so really critical question in this time of global inaction. The question is, what is the way forward? And on this score, I would like to say that the United States increasingly has led on this front with both sanctions, travel bans, and the use of instruments like the Leahy Law, the Magnitsky Law, and appropriations designations. However, in a global context in which China plays off Sri Lanka plays off China, India, and the United States, international pressure for accountability seems even more remote. So the human rights situation in Sri Lanka arguably requires that as a key partner and member of the international community, the United States must engage the government in developing meaningful human rights benchmarks for which Sri Lanka is held to account before providing technical support and humanitarian assistance. Benchmarks should include genuine security sector reform, the full commitment to pursuing those responsible for grave crimes, and ensuring that at least the mothers of the disappeared are able to learn the fate of loved ones. The US government should also consider providing assistance to victims who pursue justice and accountability using tools like Leahy, Magnitsky, and the Torture Protection Act for victims, particularly in respect of those victims who are now US citizens and Sri Lankan perpetrators who hold dual nationality. Finally, I would like to say that Sri Lanka has had a long history of opening up in terms of civil liberties and then ferociously clamping down on those who cooperate with the international community or who work together for ethnic and religious tolerance. In the months since Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, we have seen the immediate clamping down on civil society and the shrinking space amidst his steady consolidation of power. And many good citizens have been forced into exile. Human beings really have become the collateral damage of good intentions. And what this underlines, in my view, is that the international community needs a new approach to Sri Lanka. It's not the case of waiting for a somewhat better government to come to power that one can work with. And of course, the substitution for political will with technical assistance and financial aid. It is really about the proper examination of the structural reasons why so many internationally based initiatives in Sri Lanka have failed to bring change. And of course, this must be combined with holding Sri Lanka to account for the crimes of the past and detailed investigations to assist robust vetting and sanctions. I thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Devota.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for inviting me to this hearing on Sri Lanka's upcoming parliamentary elections and the impact of COVID-19 on the island. As we know, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won last November's presidential election, and it was a landslide victory in predominantly Sinhalese areas. In areas outside the north and east, President Rajapaksa won more than 6% of the vote, than did his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa in 2015. Minorities, mainly Tamils and Muslims, voted in large numbers against both Rajapaksas. But the country's Buddhists and Sinhalese Christians also voted in higher numbers for Gotabaya Rajapaksa last November. Christians have usually voted for the United National Party as opposed to parties associated with the Rajapaksas. But the 2019 Easter Sunday terrorist bombings that partly targeted two Catholic churches, the previous government's mishandling of intelligence associated with the bombings, together with the sense that the pro-security minded Rajapaksa will have prevented the bombings, have caused Sinhalese Catholics to move towards the Gotabaya Rajapaksa camp. The fact that the Rajapaksas' allies fan Islamophobia and Islamists carried out the bombings have magnified anti-Muslim sentiment in the country, and this too contributed towards Sinhalese Catholics gravitating towards Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Parliamentary elections, however, have a different dynamic from presidential elections, because while voters usually choose between two candidates during a presidential election, they choose among a number of candidates during parliamentary elections. That said, most minorities will vote for their parties and against those allied with the Rajapaksa camp, but most Buddhists and Sinhalese Catholics will vote for those contesting as part of the Rajapaksa coalition. The Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the SLPP, which is the party associated with the Rajapaksas, and its alliance appears set to win the most number of seats in parliament. While the alliance is most unlikely to win a supermajority, it will win a parliamentary majority. It will likely win a parliamentary majority. In Sri Lanka, parliamentary elections usually see lower voter turnout than presidential elections. This time, fears surrounding COVID-19 could also impact turnout. In this regard, the split in the United National Party and high enthusiasm among Sinhalese Buddhists for the SLPP is bound to benefit the Rajapaksas and their allies. Following the election, will work to entice candidates from opposition parties to join them towards creating a supermajority. Whether or not the Rajapaksa alliance garners a supermajority, Sri Lanka under President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is likely to experience additional anti-minority politicking and further militarization. Most countries demobilize following a war. Sri Lanka did not. Instead, under then Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the military continued to recruit personnel. Since becoming president, President Rajapaksa has empowered serving and retired military personnel, many, as Yasmin Suka mentioned, having committed war crimes or accused of committed war crimes during the Civil War, by appointing them to various positions, including overseeing the response to COVID-19. This trend towards increased militarization will continue, and the extent to which it undermines the civil service and elected officials will negatively impact the island's democracy in the years ahead. Sri Lanka's military remains one of the most popular institutions in the island, mainly due to its defeat of the LTTE. The decision to have the military play a leading role in battling the coronavirus pandemic was also popular among the vast majority of Sri Lankans. Many consider a strong military essential, given fears about a LTTE resurgence and the potential for further Islamist extremism. But a force of over 275,000 military personnel during peacetime is hardly necessary. Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists, however, want a large military to tame Muslims and Tamils and eventually make the northern and eastern provinces Buddhist majority areas. And the nationalist project is linked to militarization. This renewed conspicuous militarization and the apparent impunity those close to President Rajapaksa enjoy, however, have already stifled voices within civil society and created fear among minorities, even as it has further emboldened the extremists among Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists. The surveillance of predominantly Tamil areas has continued since the Civil War ended, but this now appears to have been ramped up even as surveillance of civil society has been renewed. The expanding militarization, increased surveillance, and general fear psychosis stemming from the authoritarian manner in which the last Rajapaksa regime operated have led to self-censorship within media and concern that things could get worse after parliamentary elections. There initially was an attempt to blame the Muslim community for the spread of COVID-19, but subsequent coronavirus clusters unrelated to Muslims has stamped down such accusations. Muslims, however, believed to have died due to the virus have been forcibly cremated, a practice that goes against Muslim beliefs and World Health Organization recommendations. The official number of deaths due to COVID-19 has remained at 11 in Sri Lanka for the past few weeks. While the number is certainly higher, the government has sought to paint a more positive picture as it does not want parliamentary elections postponed for a third time. This has caused some government officials to change lab results from COVID positive to COVID negative, while others have refused to allow autopsies for those suspected of having died due to COVID-19. Sri Lanka faced a dire economic situation before COVID. The coronavirus crisis, however, has led to a drastic drop in export revenue, undermined the tourism sector, and caused a sharp drop in worker remittances. This will unleash a balance of payments crisis made worse due to the island's debt crisis. The country owes around $55 billion and needs to pay close to $3 billion to service debts this year alone. Over the next few years, it needs to cough up between $4 and $5 billion every year to service debts. The Rajapaksa government will have no choice but resort to drastic measures when dealing with the economy following the parliamentary elections. Whether it can do so without fanning communal tensions and undermining democracy is the big question. Thank you.
I think you're muted.
Danny, you're muted, buddy. Are you introducing the next panelist? Ready to go?
Now I'm off. Ms. Ganguly.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Davis, for inviting me to this briefing. We welcome the chance to draw your attention to the grave concerns about human rights developments in Sri Lanka since the election of Gotabaya Rajapaksa as president in November 2019. These developments require crucial renewed engagement of concerned governments, including the United States. The government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has quickly reversed the modest gains on human rights and transitional justice that were achieved under the previous administration. His government's overt hostility to the minority Tamil and Muslim communities has undermined the limited progress in post-war reconciliation efforts. Without parliamentary oversight and taking advantage of COVID-19 restrictions, the government, since taking office, has rapidly expanded the military's control over numerous aspects of civilian life, including policing, employment, supervision of NGOs, even demographic history by link to sensitive archaeology, which is how they determine how Sri Lankans determine their ethnic and religious identities. Yasmin has spoken a bit about the sort of intense militarization of civilian governance, and these aspects, a range of civilian duties are now resting with the military. In fact, military officers, some of them credibly accused of war crimes and other abuses, now occupy powerful civilian and military roles. In terms of the intimidation of victim families and activists, we have found that security forces and intelligence agencies have intensified surveillance and threats against Tamils who have been demanding justice, in particular the families of victims of enforced disappearances. Thousands of Tamils are believed to have been forcibly disappeared in the decades of conflict, and the danger of this policy became evident because in November 2019, a government investigator, a police official who was looking into these cases, who was investigating a case in which the Navy was involved, the Sri Lankan Navy was involved in a case of enforced disappearances, had to flee the country because he was worried that after the Rajapaksa government came in, they would punish him for his work. There have been an increase in threats, assaults, and intimidation against journalists, victim representatives, civil society activists, by who they believe to be members of the security and intelligence agencies. Often these are phone calls, often these are visits where they ask for staff details. Some of the cases that we are following, for instance, is that of journalist Darisha Bastins, who is a former editor of the Sunday Observer newspaper. She's a contributor to the New York Times. Her family and associates have been persecuted by Sri Lankan police in retaliation for her work. Police have obtained and published her phone records. They've searched her house. They've seized her laptop computer. Guru, a human rights activist and lawyer, a wonderful Tamil activist, was banned from teaching law because after he appeared in a case as counsel on behalf of victims of enforced disappearances. And these are just some of the cases. They're often, we don't name people because of security reasons. But particularly in the Tamil-dominated North and East, we have heard of numerous cases where police and intelligence officers have tried to instill fear in human rights groups, to intimidate them, and to demand staff information. The other aspects that is really concerning is the targeting of Muslims and Tamils. Their position in Sri Lanka is now precarious. Government officials and ruling party supporters have repeatedly and publicly stigmatized and discriminated against Tamils and Muslims. These communities are collectively blamed, whether for actions by the LTTE or more recently, the Easter Sunday bombings that was discussed by previous speakers. The Tamils and Muslims bear the brunt of increasingly aggressive police and security force surveillance. And I should also flag that on social media, there is a lot of extremely toxic vilification of these communities. In fact, Facebook investigated its own role in some of the violence that occurred in Sri Lanka targeting Tamils, targeting Muslims. And to go on, again, this was mentioned earlier that COVID-19 victims, the government said the COVID-19 victims have to be cremated, which is contrary to the Islamic tradition. And after this, 4 UN special rapporteurs found that this regulation was discriminatory and violated the right to freedom of religion. But instead of sort of addressing these concerns, we have seen that those that spoke up can be punished. For instance, Hijaz Hizbullah, a lawyer who has represented victims of human rights violations, has been arrested under the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA. The day before his arrest, Hizbullah had joined others in submitting a letter addressed to the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, criticizing the denial of burial rights to Muslims. Ramzi Razik was arrested for his social media posts because he condemned all forms of religious extremism but also flagged hate speech against Muslims. He has been denied bail, remains in custody. As you've heard from other speakers, it has now been 11 years since the civil war in Sri Lanka ended. All parties were responsible for countless laws of war violations, but this is the situation that we are dealing with right now, because as Defense Secretary in his brother's administration from 2005 to 2015, Gotabaya Rajapaksa carried responsibility for the government's conduct of the war. His brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was president at that time, is currently the prime minister. After the war, during the Mahinda Rajapaksa presidency, serious abuses continued, including arbitrary arrest and torture of Tamil suspects and severe repression of freedom of expression and association. Mahinda Rajapaksa was defeated in 2015. The new government that was elected joined the Human Rights Council Consensus Resolution 30/1 of 2015. I mention this in particular because the Human Rights Council and this resolution is something that Sri Lankan victim families really trusted. They had set great hope in this. The US had played a key role at that time in bringing this resolution. And the Sri Lankan government had, of course, made a number of pledges, including to establish an accountability mechanism to address international crimes. There were some improvements in the human rights situation between 2015 and 2019. Victim groups were able to protest. We saw a number of families of the disappeared, for instance, hold vigils on the streets asking for answers. There was greater freedom of expression. But on the key issues, on truth and reconciliation, on accountability, the previous government also failed to take steps. Certainly on getting rid of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was one of the commitments that was made, or on security sector reform, there was very little progress. So now, under this current Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, there are once again very serious warning signs of future abuses. And we believe that at this point, international commitment to not only seeking justice for victims of rights violations in the past, but also what can happen going forward has to be very, very serious. Sri Lanka was failed in the past. The UN even ordered an investigation into its own failures, which is known as the Petrie Report. So this time round, the urgency is intense. Soon after taking office, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration has, however, told the Human Rights Council that it is renouncing its pledges under the Resolution 30/1. He has repeatedly vowed to protect war heroes, as he calls them, from prosecution, which are soldiers that have been accused of human rights violations during the war. He has recently pardoned a soldier who was convicted of massacring 8 civilians, including children. This was one of the few cases where that had been wartime cases that had been successfully prosecuted in Sri Lanka. He has appointed as Defense Secretary Kamal Gunaratne, who, as commander of the 53rd Division, was implicated in mass atrocities at the end of the war. His army chief, as you've heard already, is Savendra Silva, who commanded the 58th Division. On February 14th, the United States banned Savendra Silva from traveling to the US under the sanction regime, which was a welcome move. But much more needs to be done. There is an urgent need to uphold human rights and protect civic space through strong public statements from the international community, including from US officials. Specific abuses should be highlighted. There should be sanctions recommended against senior officials who are linked to rights violations. We urge that and say that if we fail to do so now, it would be an application of responsibility to help protect Sri Lanka's most marginalized communities from abuses and to promote the work of human rights defenders, journalists, and other civil society activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ganguly. And now we will go to the Reverend Dr. Cruz. Dr. Cruz, you're on. You may want to unmute. You will need to unmute now. Thank you.
Okay, I've done that. Thank you, dear co-chairs and others who are viewing this. And good morning to you. It's evening here. Anyway, I wish you all a good day. The previous 3 speakers have almost covered all the things that I have prepared. In any case, because I'm coming from the northern part of Sri Lanka, I would like to reiterate, sometimes maybe repeat certain things here. The title is Elections, COVID and Threats to Democracy in Sri Lanka. With regard to COVID-19, Sri Lanka was spared from COVID-19 pandemic comparatively, comparing to other countries, due to the timely action taken by this government, health department, and the people who cooperated with the above. We are thankful to the government for this. But appointing the General of the Armed Forces as the head of this operation raises many questions in our minds. Of course, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the police play a part in keeping law and order in a situation like this, but a civilian medical expert should be at the helm and guide the government and the forces. That is our thinking. In the north and east, which is considered to be the traditional homeland of the Tamils, COVID-19 is used as an excuse to increase the military presence. There are too many roadblocks and checkpoints. Last week, I traveled from Mana to Jaffna, which is just about 120 kilometers, and there were more than 5 checkpoints where the passengers had to get down from the buses and walk a distance. Whereas in the south, there are no checkpoints at all. That's what I hear. I do not understand how the checking of bags and persons may prevent COVID-19. The case of the cremated Muslim that has been covered. Due to the lockdown, many poor families were affected without work. Those people whom we call the daily wage earners. The relief given by the government to these people in the north and east, I'm not speaking about the south, they are not sufficient at all. We learned that World Health Organization, United States, and many local donors have contributed a lot of money to manage the pandemic, but the poor in our area did not receive enough. I mean, we were trying to give them some help, but even the church was not able to get help from the other. Usually we get help from other Catholic countries, other organizations, but since everyone was affected, we could not do that. So the poor people were starving actually. The government employees were paid an extra allowance for their overtime they worked, but with COVID-19, that facility has been suspended, scrapped. Since the parliament was dissolved before the pandemic or before the measures taken here with regard to the pandemic, without the parliament, measures could not be implemented very strongly with regard to these just measures. So it was only an authoritarian measure to they managed their own measures with the military. Now coming to the parliamentary elections, as many have pointed out, in the south, human rights activists fear that if the former ruling party gets a 2/3 majority, the situation will worsen. We heard about the journalists, the human rights workers being affected. Some of them have fled the country. So I want to say the 19th amendment to the constitution may be reversed and absolute power would be vested on the executive, the president. This would lead to interference by the tri-forces in civil administration. Already in our area, in the north and east, the army and navy are involved in controlling the civil administration. For example, soil excavation, transportation, drugs smuggling, everything is controlled by the army, not the police. As for the consequences, as for us, the consequences will be very serious if 2/3 majority is won by one party. UN Human Rights Council resolutions 30/1, 35/1, 40/1 recommended transitional justice process, and then Sri Lanka also co-sponsored the resolutions. But after the presidential elections last year in Sri Lanka, the president outrightly rejected these resolutions and said they will not abide by them. Hence, instead of transitional justice process, the military will be used to control our area more. Already there is militarization. Now, we also fear about this increasing Buddhistization in our area. Already in the east, they this archaeological department and this wildlife department, they are saying that they found archaeological evidence of ancient Buddhist temples and all. So this is going to increase in the future. And the present struggle of the Tamil people with regard to involuntary disappeared people, political prisoners, land theft, everything, that has been going on. As somebody said, the interim government, so the previous government, Sirisena government gave some outlet for us to do this, but I don't agree. I mean, there were chances, there were possibilities for the people to demonstrate, but there was no use. I mean, the government, as somebody pointed earlier, they didn't find anyone who disappeared. We also fear, in order to gain two-thirds majority, there will be a lot of election mix practices, like fraudulent election processes, vote rigging, malpractices, meddling with ballot boxes, which has we were fearing earlier, which has happened earlier. They also may be rampant this time. In these elections, also in the North and East, the Tamil parties have separated, regrouped, and multiplied. There is confusion among the people whom to support. This situation is favorable to the government and is surely encouraged by them, if not created by them. For example, just one example, my electoral district is called Vandi. For 6 seats, 45 parties and independent groups consisting of 405 contestants are contesting for these 6 seats. The Jaffna seat, Jaffna electoral division is something even worse. Finally, coming to 2019 Easter Sunday bombings in Colombo, Negombo and Batticaloa, the perpetrators are named as ISIS, but there are too many unanswered questions, as pointed out earlier in this panel. On account of this, the Christians in Sri Lanka and especially Tamil Christians are affected now and then also. Second comes the Muslims. Some put the blame on the Muslims, whereas all Muslims are not culpable. But as we heard earlier, many of them are being affected or criticized for this. Taking this as excuse, the military is consolidating their agenda of militarization of the North and East. Every Saturday, they come to my church, 4 or 5 military persons. They say that there is information of a threat of a bomb blast, or they have got some information. So they stay here overnight. I think they want to monitor my Sunday homily the following day. The Bishop's House of Mana and many churches look like mini military camps with 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days, military presence. The people are scared, or many a time they positively avoid coming to the church or going to the bishop's house. I think it's a serious religious rights infringement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz. We now come to the question part of our briefing. I'm going to yield to Representative Johnson for any questions that he might have. Then I've got a question or two, and then we'll open up to everybody on the panel, everybody in the group. So, Bill, if you've got any questions, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. I only have one question, and I think I wanted to ask Ms. Suka. How likely do you think it is that that in the parliamentary elections that are coming up, that the Rajapaksas could secure this 2/3 majority in the parliament? Because that's going to be a game changer if they do.
Thank you for that question. I said that there were really 2 scenarios, and I think that The one is obviously an outright win if they secure the similar vote, which will really be based on a kind of nationalistic agenda. And we've actually seen that going forward. But I think what you're also seeing, and I think both the father and Professor De Voter alluded to this, that when you look at the contestation at parliamentary level, you're also seeing the proliferation of many smaller parties. And of course, with that, you're having the trading of alliances. And so what one would anticipate, I think, is that already there's a lot of discussion going on, and there's a lot of promises really of what we will do for you if you join with us. And that is really splitting, I think, the vote of bigger parties which would normally go in a particular direction. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the elections, I anticipate that we will see a lot of horse trading, and that way they will secure that 2/3 majority. There's also a huge element of fear. And when you look at the kind of presidential task forces that have been set up, this is clearly designed to intimidate people into supporting them. And already, we've been receiving information in the last 2 or 3 weeks that people are being picked up, they're being questioned, and you also heard Father speak about the fact that the level of surveillance has increased. And when people are brought in for questioning, what they're being asked is, are you a member of the revamped LTTE? Now, anybody who knows Sri Lankan politics will know that this is absolute nonsense, because they've been wiped out practically completely. So I would say that both using money and the promise of positions, you're going to see a realignment. And of course, Sri Lanka also has a history of realignment of political parties, as we even saw in the last election with people changing sides. So this is devastating, actually. And in this consolidation of power, you're seeing shifting sands.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then I've got a question or two. Why is accountability for past crimes so important? And either one of you could take a shot at that. I'm saying we're going through a period here in the United States where we're removing symbols and items, and so why is accountability for the past crimes important to this process?
I'm happy to take a shot at this question, having really worked on this issue for many, many years. And I think when we talk about accountability, we're not only talking about criminal accountability, but we're also talking about the fact that there's a consensus that over decades that has emerged that unless you deal with the crimes that have been systemically possible because of the structural institutionalization of racism, ethnic discrimination, and inequality, which are really conflict drivers, you will never really be able to build the notion of a new state in which people feel that they are able to reclaim their rights as full citizens. Now, of course, you can't prosecute everybody. And I think you see the recognition of that in the fact that not only do you have the notion that only those who bear the greatest responsibility should be prosecuted, but you've also seen the development of institutions like truth commissions, which are meant to allow victims to come forward, to speak about the pain and suffering they have endured, and to have that acknowledged by the state. But it's also the responsibility of these accountability mechanisms to ensure that they not only look at the individual kinds of responsibility, but they also look into the structural dimensions of conflict which allow these violations to be possible. And this is certainly in line with many of the debates that are taking place in the United States at this moment. as we deal with protests around Black Lives Matter, many people are reaching out and saying that the first thing that needs to happen is that people need to be heard about the wounds that they've experienced, the suffering they've endured. And then, of course, that allows for a process of acknowledgement and reparations. And if we do all of these things well, as we have seen in many countries across the world, we build the notion of what we call non-repetition, which is really based on the reform of institutions. And it reminded me, as we were dealing with the discussions and debates that are taking place, there's an economist in the United States who really unpacked in a recent report the fact that Black areas had been redlined and that Black people had never been able to access the kind of benefits that were given to people which allowed them to own property. And all of these are practices which in fact perpetuate inequity and inequality. And so these are possible then of being reversed. And so, when we look at the decades of experience in this field around the world, I think we need to see multiple forms of accountability. I also spoke to the notion of what I call innovative practices. And, in the absence of being able to hold people accountable, we've begun to compile dossiers of the crimes they have committed. We've begun to name them. And those dossiers are now successfully being used in many different places across the world. And so I think that what it opens up is really the notion of the restoration of dignity, which is necessary for a state to move forward, building, of course, a new notion of what it means to be a citizen.
Would I be accurate if I was to suggest that you're saying that acknowledgement leads to healing and helps with the healing process, and that healing is a part of what must take place if some of the past feelings of prejudicial treatment that continues is going to be reconciled, and that becomes a part of the reconciliation process?
Absolutely. It's not that we don't know what has happened, but it's not enough for us as individuals to know. It's really important that the whole society is able to hear about the suffering of victims and survivors, and then to have a public acknowledgement of what has happened to them, recognizing that the state or some other body has been responsible for their pain and suffering. And there's a great deal of evidence which has demonstrated that in the speaking, the hearing, and the listening, people to some extent are freed of carrying the burden that is not just intergenerational, but one which has been borne for so many centuries. And that then allows for a space in which people can begin to dialogue with each other so that they understand what gave rise to these institutional processes and structural violations systemically in a society. So the healing, and this is what we speak about, that healing traumatized societies, absolutely critical, because what you want to prevent is the intergenerational dimension that really follows through. And I think we see that in almost all of our societies. And that's what we need really to free ourselves of the pain of being victims and really moving to the reclaiming of agency in which we become survivors and authors of our own destiny.
I've always hoped that the United States would become more involved. And I guess the question is, what can the U.S. do without becoming oppressive or overbearing to help the process along? What can we do more or better than what I feel we're currently doing without crossing the line? Anybody, and I throw that to anybody on the panel.
I could try and take a stab at that. Um, I think at this particular point, the uh, the guiding principle ought to be do no harm. And I mean many things by that. This, as I mentioned in my comments, I think what we're seeing now is nothing compared to what we are likely to see on the communal front after the parliamentary elections. I think, I fear, I hope I'm dearly wrong, but I fear things are going to get worse. The economic pressures will, I think, in some ways exacerbate and push some of these players to try and use communal issues to mask some of the economic problems. And we also have the competition taking place within the Asia Pacific that the Rajapaksas, especially, I think, played very deftly. If you look at the promises they made to the Indians leading up to the end of the civil war, promises that were not kept for the most part, and the enormous debt that has to be serviced, and the way the Chinese are positioning themselves to maybe help with that in exchange for, more influence. So you have a foreign policy, considerations that can be cast aside here. And one of the things I would suggest is that we keep in mind that as long as there are relatively free and fair elections, Sri Lankans do have a history of voting parties out. Nobody expected Mahinda Rajapaksa to lose in 2015, and yet he lost. It's my fear is that we could get to a point with this regime where elections in the future get postponed, or they get rigged to such an extent that we have kind of a Putinesque situation in Sri Lanka, where we will have elections, but the opposition will never come into power for a long, long time. So, it's not the most satisfying response, I'm sure, especially for those of us who care about human rights, for those of us who understand the importance of transitional justice. This does not mean not discussing the issue. This does not mean not, calling people out. This does not mean not sanctioning, some of the people responsible for the most grotesque crimes. But I think there are, a number of things that have to be considered, because I think Sri Lanka today is more important geostrategically than it was 15 or 20 years ago because of the rise of China and its tentacles spreading in South Asia. So for those reasons, my my advice would be, do no harm, but at the same time, keep the pressure.
If I could add to some of this specific things that we are concerned about. Since 2015, there has been DoD has been engaging in military cooperation with the Sri Lankan military, and we do worry about what kind of mil cooperation is going to exist going forward, because with the military, with the tri-forces as they're called, on all wings of them having been involved in serious violations. As you know, the MCC has made a grant to Sri Lanka, which has taken a long time to process. So as it happens, it will possibly come through under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime. And therefore, all the standards that were looked at, some of the boxes that were ticked when this grant was made, no longer apply. That's the same thing that we speak to EU about on the GSP status, because one of the key things that was promised was the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is still not being done. We are also slightly concerned about the sort of continuing use of UN peacekeepers after the initial comment by the UN that they would no longer use Sri Lankan peacekeepers, but that has continued. Those are some of the things that we are looking at. Thank you.
Chairperson, if I could just add, I always think that in these situations where we're looking at the geopolitical strategic space that Sri Lanka occupies in the South Asian region, you know, one of the things I think we have to really be careful about is the kind of nationalist allegiances which are taking place between Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and India and China. And of course, with that, the sorts of Buddhist links, which have also contributed to nationalism. And so in the way in which the US, I think, responds to the situation must also be about how it uses its leverage in terms of both providing financial support and assistance, and of course, access really to US training, etc. And so in a way, it's a carrot and stick approach. And that is why in my report, I talked about the need for the benchmarks on the one hand, and on the other, coupling that as leverage to really ensure that Sri Lanka also understands that this is not about punishing them, but it's really about helping them understand that their shared future lies in the recognition that it cannot be built on atrocities. And when you look at the line of atrocities going right back so many decades, it's really because these institutions have never been dismantled. And that is why it's possible over many decades to have different kinds of mass atrocities targeted at different ethnic groups. And that's something we have to really be careful about, because we could reverse all of the gains under this presidency. And so it's really important to begin to think strategically about what are the carrots, what are the sticks, and how can that be used? And I think you have an array of instruments which have been incredibly useful. Sri Lanka has also indicated that while they want to withdraw from the UN, they also want to be peacekeepers. And so that is a point of leverage that I think should be used, as well as, of course, you know, Magnitsky, Leahy, etc.
Danny, I think we've got time for one more question, or at least I do. I think Sam Ilangoben has a question.
Thank you all.
Please go right ahead.
Thank you all very much. I have a question for Madam Suka. The Sri Lankan government agreed to the UNHRC resolutions. Now, if they reject, what choice do we have? The South African regime listened only to the economic boycott. Are we heading there?
I obviously, in the case of South Africa, sanctions and the arms embargo and the UN resolution, which in fact declared that apartheid was a crime against humanity, was really central to the dismantling of the apartheid regime. And of course, that was coupled with the international solidarity, which really prevented South Africa after 1980 from being able to borrow money. And given that they were fighting a war on the borders, nobody wanted to see body bags come home. And that really gave the impetus to the negotiations. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, yes, you do have the resolution. And I think that it's going to really be important for member states in the UN Human Rights Council to begin to think about how do they help a fellow member state to understand that this is not just about sanctioning them, but that they remind them that there can be sanctions that can be instituted if they do not, in fact, follow a particular line. And this is not just about leadership and governance, it's also about people, the human beings who are living to some extent under state-sponsored tyranny. And I think that's what we always need to keep in mind. What do we need to do for victims and survivors in order for a country to move forward? And given the polarization that exists, what steps need to be instituted to build really relationships between different ethnic communities?
Well, let me ask, are there any other comments, any other questions, any other concerns that Anybody would like to raise? Well, if not, Bill, let me thank you. It's always a pleasure being with you and working with you. I want to thank all of the panelists as well as everybody that's been involved and engaged. Reverend Jesse Jackson has a word that he uses all the time. He says that we have to keep hope alive. And so work generally keeps hope alive. So I suggest that we continue to work and continue to have as much faith that our efforts are going to be productive. And as long as we do that, I think that progress is on the way. So let me thank you all. Have a delightful day. It's been a pleasure for me, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
God bless you all.
Okay.
Good job.